Something was already here, long before the Celts arrived in Britain. Something older, stranger, and far more sophisticated than anyone in the ancient world was prepared to admit. When the Romans finally pushed their legions across the Channel and stood for the first time on British soil, they did not find a simple island of painted barbarians. They found ruins they could not explain, earthworks that defied their engineering logic, astronomical alignments so precise they made Roman mathematicians uncomfortable, and a memory carried in the mouths of the oldest locals that pointed to a civilization so ancient it had already become legend before Julius Caesar was born. This is the story they did not teach you in school. This is the story of the people who were in Britain before everyone we think of as ancient, before the Celts who fascinated the Romans, before the Beaker migrants who swept across Europe in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, before even the Neolithic farmers who built the first stone monuments on the British landscape. There were people here so deeply rooted in this island that their bones, their monuments, and their astronomical genius persisted through every invasion, every replacement, every catastrophe for thousands of years. And what they built was so extraordinary that even the most powerful empire the Western world had ever produced looked at the remains and felt something close to fear. Before we go further, take a second and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. It genuinely means a lot to see how far these stories travel. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden history of Britain and the ancient world, hit like and subscribe so you never miss one. The island of Britain sits at the northwestern edge of the European continent, separated from the mainland by a channel that was not always there. For most of human prehistory, Britain was not an island at all. It was a peninsula, a cold, wind-swept extension of a vast landmass that stretched from the Atlantic coast all the way to the steppes of Central Asia. The land bridge that once connected Britain to what is now the Netherlands and Denmark was called Doggerland, and it was home to some of the earliest communities of anatomically modern humans in northwestern Europe. These were not primitive cave dwellers scraping at flint in the dark. They were sophisticated hunters and gatherers who understood the movement of animals, the cycles of rivers, the patterns of seasons, and the slow shifting of a landscape that was still recovering from the last great ice age. They built temporary shelters, they crafted tools of extraordinary refinement, and they moved through a landscape of forests, marshes, and river systems that no longer exists because the sea swallowed it. Around 9,000 years ago, the ice that had locked so much of the planet's water had melted enough to raise sea levels dramatically. Doggerland began to flood. The communities living on that lowland peninsula were forced to retreat, some moving west onto the higher ground of what would become the British Isles, others moving east into the continental interior. By around 6,500 years before the Common Era, Britain was an island. The people who had retreated to its shores were cut off from the continent, and what happened to them in that isolation over the following thousands of years is one of the most extraordinary and least understood stories in all of human prehistory. The Mesolithic people of Britain, the hunter-gatherers who lived on this island before farming arrived, left behind a world that archaeology is only beginning to understand. At Starcar in North Yorkshire, excavations have revealed a site of almost unimaginable richness for its age. Over 10,000 years ago, people were living at Starcar in organized, structured ways that challenge every assumption about so-called primitive pre-agricultural societies. They built platforms of worked timber at the edge of a lake. They crafted headdresses from red deer skulls, carefully perforated so they could be worn, suggesting ritual practices of considerable complexity. They made barbed points from antler for hunting, shaped bones into tools of specific and deliberate design, and they returned to the same site repeatedly over hundreds of years, meaning they understood territorial attachment, seasonal movement, and the geography of their landscape in ways that require sophisticated cognitive mapping. What does cognitive mapping mean in this context? It means they knew where they were going before they went there. They understood not just the place they currently occupied, but the relationship between that place and other places across a wide landscape. They made decisions about resource use that required thinking not just about today, but about next season, next year, the long arc of cycles they had observed across generations. This is not the behavior of people operating at the edge of human capability. This is the behavior of people with culture, with memory, with tradition, with the kind of accumulated knowledge that only comes from communities that have been functioning and passing information down for a very long time. And Star is not unique. Sites across Britain from this period reveal consistent patterns of sophisticated behaviour. At Howick in Northumberland, there is evidence of a substantial circular structure that may have been a house, built around 7,700 years before the Common Era, making it one of the earliest known permanent or semi-permanent structures in Britain. At Thatcham in Berkshire, another Mesolithic site shows evidence of repeated occupation and tool manufacture at a scale that suggests not a casual campsite, but an organised location of cultural and economic significance. The people who built these places, who returned to them generation after generation, who refined their tools and their rituals and their understanding of the land over thousands of years, were the ancestors of something that would emerge on the British landscape with dramatic force around 6,000 years ago. The Neolithic Revolution reached Britain around 4000 BCE. Farming arrived, brought by migrants from continental Europe who crossed the Channel and began establishing agricultural communities in the south and east of the island. But here is where the history becomes genuinely strange. The genetic evidence from ancient DNA analysis tells us something remarkable about what happened when farmers met the indigenous hunter-gatherers of Britain. In most of Europe, the story of the Neolithic transition is one of replacement. The incoming farmers, who were themselves descended from Anatolian migrants who had spread agriculture westward across Europe, largely replaced the indigenous hunter-gatherer populations genetically. But in Britain, something different happened. There was genuine mixing, there was cultural exchange, and the resulting population that emerged from the encounter between incoming farmers and indigenous Mesolithic Britons was a hybrid in the truest sense, carrying genes from both groups and, crucially, some vivet, carrying something from the indigenous inhabitants that shaped the entire subsequent trajectory of British prehistory. That something was a relationship with the land that was already ancient beyond reckoning when the farmers arrived. The hunter-gatherers of Britain had been on this island for thousands of years before the Neolithic migrants showed up. They had developed relationships with specific places, specific rivers, specific hills, specific coastlines that had been handed down through uncountable generations. They had rituals connected to those places. They had stories about those places. They had ways of understanding the landscape that were not just practical, but deeply symbolic, deeply spiritual in the broadest sense of that word. And when the incoming farmers encountered this existing framework of meaning, rather than simply overwriting it, they absorbed it, adapted it, and built upon it in ways that produced the most spectacular monumental landscape in the prehistoric world. The megalithic tradition of Britain and Ireland is unlike anything else on Earth. Structures built from enormous stones, sometimes weighing dozens of tons, arranged with precision across a landscape that stretches from the tip of Cornwall to the northernmost islands of Scotland. These are not random piles of rock. They are not the accidental accumulations of geological process. They are the product of deliberate, organized, sustained human effort, applied over centuries and millennia to create something that was meant to endure. And they did endure. Many of them are still standing today, 5 or 6 or 7,000 years after the people who built them placed the last stone in position. The Long Barrows of Britain are perhaps the least glamorous of the megalithic monuments, but in many ways they are the most revealing about the people who built them. Structures like Wayland's Smithy in Oxfordshire, West Kennet in Wiltshire, and the Cotswold Seven Tombs scattered across the limestone belt of southwest England are collective burial chambers. They were built to house not individual burials, but the disarticulated bones of entire communities, mixed together in chambers of stone in ways that suggest a fundamentally different understanding of death, identity, and community than anything in the modern world. The bones inside these chambers were not left and forgotten. They were actively managed. They were rearranged. They were removed and returned. They were used in rituals that continued for generations after the structure was first sealed. This is a relationship with the dead, with ancestral presence, with the continuity between living and dead community members. That points to a level of social and spiritual sophistication that no one should underestimate. West Kennet, Long Barrow, which sits in the Avebury landscape in Wiltshire, was built around 3500 BCE and was used for burials and rituals for over 1,000 years before it was finally sealed. 1,000 years. To put that in perspective, 1,000 years ago from today takes us back to before the Norman conquest of England. The people who were managing the bones in West Kennet Long Barrow were doing so across a time span equivalent to the entire distance between us and the Battle of Hastings. The institutional memory required to maintain that kind of continuous practice across so many generations is extraordinary. It speaks to communities with deep roots, strong traditions, and a capacity for cultural continuity that we would have to work very hard to match today. But the Long Barrows are merely the foundation. What emerges from the Long Barrow tradition is something that would come to define not just British prehistory, but the entire concept of what prehistoric civilization looked like. The Henge monuments. And at the center of the Henge tradition, in all its overwhelming, inexplicable, terrifying genius, stands Stonehenge. Stonehenge is so famous that it has almost lost its capacity to shock. We see images of it constantly. It appears on postcards, in films, in corporate logos, in tourist brochures. The familiarity has dulled the astonishment. But strip away the familiarity and look at what Stonehenge actually is, and what it actually represents, and the shock returns with full force. Stonehenge was not built all at once. It evolved over roughly 1,500 years, from around 3000 BCE to around 1500 BCE, through a series of phases that each represent a different conception of what the monument was supposed to be and what it was supposed to do. The earliest phase was an earthwork, a circular ditch and bank with a ring of pits inside it, some of which contained cremation burials. This is already remarkable. The scale of communal effort required to dig the ditch and bank at Stonehenge with the tools available around 3000 BCE is considerable. And the fact that it was used for burials from the very beginning tells us that the site had a relationship with the dead, with ancestral memory, with the same world that produced the Long Barrows. But it is the second and third phases that produce the Stonehenge we recognize, and that produce the questions that have never been fully answered. Around 2500 BCE, massive stones began to arrive at the site. The first to arrive were the blue stones, 80 or so pillars of spotted dolerite and other igneous rock, sourced from the Preseli Hills in southwest Wales, around 250 miles away. How they got there is a question that has generated enormous debate. The most widely accepted explanation is that they were moved by human effort, using sledges, rollers, and possibly rafts for the sea and river portions of the journey. But the logistics of moving 80 stones, some weighing up to 4 tons, across 250 miles of Neolithic Britain, crossing rivers, bogs, forests, and sea inlets, coordinating the labor of potentially thousands of people over years or decades, is so staggering that it requires us to fundamentally revise our assumptions about the organizational capacity of these communities. Who was giving orders? Who was coordinating the workforce? Who decided which stones to take? Where to take them from? How to transport them? Where exactly to place them when they arrived? These are not questions with simple answers. The scale of the Stonehenge project implies the existence of authority structures, planning mechanisms, communication networks, and resource management systems that are completely absent from the standard narrative of prehistoric Britain as a world of small, independent farming communities. Then the Sarsen stones arrived, the great trilithons, the iconic horseshoe of massive paired uprights topped by lintels that defines the central arrangement of Stonehenge, are made from Sarsen sandstone, sourced from Marlborough Downs, around 25 miles to the north. The largest of these stones weighs around 25 tons. The lintels that sit atop the uprights were shaped with a technique called dressing, using stone tools to produce smooth, flat surfaces, and they were fitted to the uprights using a system of mortise and tenon joints, the same joinery technique used by carpenters. Stone joints. Neolithic people applied the logic of woodworking joinery to monumental stone construction, shaping the tops of the uprights into tenons and cutting corresponding mortise holes in the undersides of the lintels so that they locked together. This level of precision stoneworking, applied at this scale, at this date, is not supposed to exist in Britain in 2500 BCE. And then there is the astronomy. Stonehenge is oriented so that on the summer solstice, the rising sun aligns precisely with the heel stone and shines directly into the center of the monument. On the winter solstice, the setting sun aligns with the central trilithon. The site also encodes alignments with the rising and setting points of the moon at its extreme positions in its 18.6-year cycle. These are not accidental orientations. They require sustained astronomical observation over multiple generations, the development of a system for recording those observations, the mathematical ability to calculate the geometry required to produce precise alignments in a fixed structure, and the engineering skill to build that structure to the required tolerances. This is not primitive. This is not the work of people at the beginning of human cognitive development. This is the work of a civilization with deep scientific knowledge, expressed in the only medium available to them at the time: stone. The Avebury complex, which lies a few miles north of Stonehenge, is in many ways even more impressive in its sheer scale. The main henge at Avebury is the largest stone circle in the world. Its outer ditch and bank enclose an area of around 11 hectares, and within that enclosure there originally stood an outer circle of about 100 large sarsen stones and 2 smaller inner circles. The bank of the Avebury henge, now much reduced by centuries of erosion and agricultural damage, was originally around 4 meters high and ran for over a kilometer around the outside of the ditch. The ditch itself was dug to a depth of around 10 meters into the solid chalk bedrock. The volume of chalk that was removed in digging that ditch is estimated at around 200,000 tons. It was removed using antler picks and ox shoulder blade shovels, without the benefit of metal tools, and almost certainly without the benefit of wheeled vehicles. The scale of this achievement is not easily grasped from the outside. You have to stand in the ditch at Avebury, looking up at the bank towering above you, to begin to understand what it meant in human terms. Avebury is not an isolated monument either. It sits at the center of a landscape of monuments, a deliberately constructed ceremonial geography that extends for miles in every direction. The West Kennet Long Barrow is part of this landscape. Silbury Hill, the largest prehistoric mound in Europe, is part of this landscape. The West Kennet and Beckhampton Avenues, processional routes of paired standing stones that led into and out of the main henge, are part of this landscape. Windmill Hill, a causewayed enclosure that predates the henge and represents one of the earliest large-scale gathering places in Britain, is part of this landscape. The Sanctuary, a timber and stone circle connected to the henge by the West Kennet Avenue, is part of this landscape. This is not a collection of independent monuments that happen to end up near each other. This is a planned, organized, deliberately constructed ceremonial landscape that was developed and elaborated over more than 1,000 years, each new monument relating to the existing ones in ways that are astronomical, topographical, and symbolic. The people who built and used this landscape understood it as a unified whole. They had a concept of sacred geography that encompassed miles of countryside, that organized the physical world into a system of meaning that must have been one of the central organizing principles of their entire civilization. And Silbury Hill deserves particular attention because it is one of the most mysterious structures in the prehistoric world. It is a flat-topped mound, almost perfectly conical, rising around 37 meters above the surrounding landscape and covering an area of around 5 hectares. It was built in stages beginning around 2400 BCE, using chalk quarried from the surrounding area, and the engineering involved in its construction is remarkable. Analysis has shown that the builders used a sophisticated technique of building concentric rings of chalk rubble with a clay core to ensure structural stability, preventing the kind of slumping and erosion that would have collapsed a simple pile of loose chalk. They understood the structural engineering of mound construction at a level that was not reinvented in Europe until many centuries later. And despite all the investigations of Silbury Hill over the past 250 years, including several major excavations, no burial chamber, no central deposit of any kind has ever been found inside it. We do not know what it was for. The largest prehistoric mound in Europe was built with extraordinary skill and effort for a purpose that has completely escaped us. Now let us move north, because the megalithic civilization of Britain is not confined to the Salisbury Plain. Scotland is home to a series of monuments that are just as spectacular and, in some cases, considerably older. The Ring of Brodgar in Orkney is a stone circle of 60 original stones, now reduced to 36, set within a henge of exceptional size. It sits on a narrow strip of land between two lochs, a position of obvious landscape significance, and it aligns with various astronomical events in ways that continue to be studied and debated. But the Ring of Brodgar is part of a landscape that, like Avebury, extends far beyond the monument itself. The standing stones of Stonehenge, just over a mile away, are among the oldest standing stones in Britain, dating to around 3000 BCE. The Barnhouse settlement nearby shows the everyday life of the people who built and used these monuments. And then there is the Ness of Brodgar, which is perhaps the most extraordinary archaeological discovery in Britain in the past half-century. The Ness of Brodgar is a large ceremonial complex located on the same strip of land between the two Orkney lochs, connecting the standing stones of Stonehenge and the Ring of Brodgar. It was discovered in 2003, and excavations are still ongoing, but what has been revealed already has transformed our understanding of Neolithic Orkney and, by extension, of the entire megalithic civilization of Britain. The Ness of Brodgar consists of a series of massive stone buildings, some of the largest Neolithic buildings found anywhere in Britain, arranged within a walled enclosure. The buildings are elaborately constructed, with stone furniture, hearths, decorated stonework, and evidence of extensive use over many centuries. The quantity of animal bones found at the site, particularly cattle bones, suggests feasting on a scale that could only occur in the context of a major gathering place, drawing people from across a wide region. The decorated stonework at the Ness of Brodgar is particularly significant. Geometric patterns, incised into the stone of the buildings and associated structures, represent one of the earliest traditions of abstract art in Britain. And these patterns are not random. The same motifs appear across the Orcadian Neolithic world, on pottery, on bone objects, and in other contexts, suggesting that they were part of a shared symbolic vocabulary, a visual language that meant something specific to the people who created and used it. We cannot read that language now, but its existence tells us that the people of Neolithic Orkney had developed a system of shared meaning complex enough to require visual expression and consistent enough to maintain stable, symbolic forms across generations and across the breadth of their cultural world. Callanish, in the Western Isles of Scotland, is another monument that has never received the attention it deserves outside specialist circles. The main stone circle at Callanish, set on a promontory overlooking Loch Rogue on the Isle of Lewis, is arranged in a pattern unique among the stone circles of Britain. A circle of 13 stones with a central monolith over 4 meters tall, approached by a long double avenue of stones from the north and flanked by shorter rows of stones extending to the east, west, and south, creating a rough cross or keyhole pattern when viewed from above. The stones are of Lewisian gneiss, one of the oldest rocks on the surface of the earth, and they were erected around 2900 BCE, making Callanish contemporary with the earliest phases of Stonehenge. The astronomical significance of Callanish is concentrated around the extreme southern moonrise, the point at which the moon, at its lowest declination in its 18.6-year cycle, rises just above the hills to the south and appears to walk along the ridge before setting. This event, known as the major lunar standstill, occurs only once every 18 or 19 years, and at Callanish, the geometry of the site is precisely arranged so that during this event, the moon appears to enter the stone circle from the south avenue. This is an alignment that required sustained observation of the lunar cycle over multiple standstill events, the development of a method for predicting when the next standstill would occur, and the engineering of a monument designed to frame that predicted astronomical event with architectural precision. This is science. This is observational astronomy, combined with mathematical prediction, combined with architectural engineering. And it was being practiced on the Isle of Lewis 5,000 years ago. The question that the Roman historian Tacitus and his contemporaries never quite managed to formulate, but clearly felt, is the one that connects all of these monuments and all of this evidence. Who were these people? Not who built these individual structures, but who were the people who sustained this civilization across the entire island of Britain and the surrounding islands for over 2,000 years? What was the political organization that allowed the coordinated effort required to build Stonehenge and Avebury? What was the knowledge system that allowed astronomical observation and mathematical calculation sophisticated enough to produce the alignments at Callanish and Newgrange? What was the economic system that allowed the sustained extraction of labor required to build Silbury Hill? And what was the social system that gave meaning to all of it, that made people willing to dedicate their lives and the lives of their communities to the construction and maintenance of these extraordinary places? We cannot answer all of these questions with certainty. The people who built the megalithic monuments of Britain left no written records, but we can read what they left, and what they left tells us that the answers to those questions involve levels of social, intellectual, and organizational complexity that were simply absent from the conventional narrative of British prehistory, when that narrative was first constructed in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Victorians, who systematized the study of prehistoric Britain, were working within a framework of assumptions about human progress that made it almost impossible for them to recognize what they were seeing. They saw the evidence of extraordinary achievement, and they attributed it to people who must have been, in some sense, not quite fully human, or guided by some kind of divine intervention, or connected to a lost civilization from outside. The idea that indigenous people, the direct descendants of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had been on this island for thousands of years before the Neolithic farmers arrived, could have developed and sustained a civilization of this sophistication entirely from their own intellectual and cultural resources, was simply not thinkable within the Victorian worldview. We have to think it now, because the evidence demands it. The Beaker phenomenon, which swept across Europe from roughly 2500 BCE, brought significant demographic change to Britain. Ancient DNA studies, particularly the groundbreaking work published in the journal Nature in 2018, showed that the arrival of Beaker migrants was associated with a massive replacement of the existing population of Britain. Estimates suggest that over the course of a few hundred years, the population of Britain was replaced by around 90% from incoming migrants from the continent, primarily from the Yamnaya-derived populations of the Pontic steppe, who had already mixed with European farmer populations in Central Europe. This is a population replacement of extraordinary scale. In genetic terms, the people who built Stonehenge and Avebury were almost completely replaced by the people who finished building Stonehenge. But here is the crucial point. The replacement was genetic, not cultural. The Beaker people who arrived in Britain did not tear down Stonehenge or fill in the Avebury ditch. They continued to use these monuments, to add to them, to participate in the ritual landscape that the previous population had created. The astronomical knowledge, the ceremonial practices, the symbolic frameworks that were embedded in the megalithic landscape were adopted by the incoming population with what appears to have been very little resistance. Why? Possibly because the incoming migrants encountered the existing monuments as fait accompli, as physical expressions of a power and a knowledge so palpable that they could not be dismissed or ignored. Possibly because the existing population, though demographically overwhelmed, still contained individuals with knowledge of the monuments and their significance, and were absorbed into the new social order as specialists, as priests, or astronomers, or engineers, whose expertise was too valuable to discard. Possibly because the monuments themselves were so obviously impressive that they commanded respect from anyone who encountered them, regardless of their cultural background. The Bronze Age civilization that emerged in Britain from the Beaker transition was remarkable in its own right. The Amesbury archer, a Beaker man buried around 2300 BCE near Stonehenge, provides a stunning window into the world of this period. His grave contained over 100 objects, the richest Beaker burial found anywhere in Europe, including copper knives, gold hair ornaments, flint tools of exceptional quality, pottery vessels, and stone wrist guards. Chemical analysis of his teeth shows that he grew up in the Alpine region of Central Europe, making a journey of over 1,000 miles to reach Britain. He was not just a traveller, not just a random migrant. The richness of his burial, the quality and quantity of the objects interred with him, and his proximity to Stonehenge suggest that he was a person of considerable status, possibly a metalworker or craftsman of exceptional skill, possibly a leader, possibly someone with a specific relationship to the monument at the centre of the British sacred landscape. But the Bronze Age in Britain is not just the story of elite burials and prestige goods. It is also the story of a society of extraordinary sophistication in its everyday functioning. Must Farm in Cambridgeshire, excavated between 2015 and 2016, has been described as Britain's Bronze Age Pompeii, and the description is not excessive. Must Farm was a settlement of timber roundhouses built on stilts over a river dating to around 850 BCE. It was destroyed by fire and collapsed into the river, preserving its contents in the anaerobic mud in a state of extraordinary completeness. What the excavators found was a snapshot of everyday Bronze Age life in Britain at a level of detail never previously achieved. The inhabitants of Must Farm ate well. Their diet included fish, birds, deer, cattle, sheep, and goat, as well as plant foods including wheat, barley, hazelnuts, and sloe berries. They cooked in sophisticated pottery vessels, including cauldrons that could hold substantial quantities of food, suggesting communal cooking and feasting. They owned bronze tools and weapons of considerable variety and quality, including sickles, chisels, axes, and spearheads. They wore textiles of fine quality, with thread counts and weaving techniques that produce cloth comparable to modern hand-woven fabrics. They made glass beads and amber beads, traded from sources as distant as the Baltic coast. They used wooden bowls and platters turned on a lathe, a woodworking technique of considerable sophistication, and they maintained their settlement with a standard of construction that reflects long experience with timber architecture in a wetland environment. Must Farm is a community of people who are fed, clothed, housed, and equipped at a level that no one in the 18th century would have believed possible for people of this date in Britain. It represents a standard of living and a level of material culture that is simply incompatible with the image of primitive prehistoric Britons that dominated the cultural imagination for so long. And the trade networks that supplied Must Farm with amber from the Baltic and glass beads from continental workshops point to something equally important. Britain in the Bronze Age was not an isolated backwater. It was part of a continental and pan-European trading system that connected the island to communities across Europe and beyond. The copper and tin that produced the bronze in the tools and weapons of Must Farm and every other Bronze Age settlement in Britain came from Cornwall, Wales, and Ireland, but also from continental sources. The finished bronze objects found in Britain show stylistic connections to objects from Denmark, Germany, France, and the Iberian Peninsula. The gold used in British Bronze Age jewellery came from Ireland and from continental Europe. There were people whose job it was to move these materials and these objects across enormous distances, maintaining relationships between communities separated by sea crossings and hundreds of miles of land travel. The tin from Cornwall, in particular, places Britain at the centre of one of the most important trading networks of the ancient Bronze Age world. Tin is essential for the production of bronze, but is extremely rare in the ancient world. The Cornish tin deposits are among the most significant in Europe, and access to Cornish tin made Britain a critical node in the supply chains that kept the Bronze Age civilization of the Mediterranean world functioning. Phoenician traders are believed to have reached Cornwall in the 1st millennium BCE, and possibly earlier, to access these tin supplies. Greek sources mention the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands, which are generally identified with Cornwall and the Scilly Isles. The Greek merchant Pytheas, who sailed around Britain around 320 BCE, described a sophisticated trading economy in which tin was exchanged through a chain of intermediaries and ultimately shipped across the Channel and through France to the Mediterranean. This means that by the time the Romans began seriously contemplating the conquest of Britain, the island was already embedded in international trade networks that connected it to the Phoenician world, the Greek world, and through them, to the entire Mediterranean civilizational sphere. Britain was not unknown to the ancient world. It was a known quantity, a source of specific and valuable commodities, particularly tin, and a destination for long-distance traders. The sophistication of its trading economy was not a surprise to the Romans. What was a surprise was the physical evidence of what the civilization that had produced that trading economy had also built on the landscape. When Julius Caesar crossed the Channel in 55 and 54 BCE, the accounts he left in his Gallic Wars are the first extended first-person Roman narrative of Britain, and they are fascinating for what they notice and what they choose not to notice. Caesar describes the interior of Britain as inhabited by people he calls the original inhabitants, suggesting that the coastal and southeastern populations had more recent continental connections, while those in the interior were of greater antiquity. He notes that the Druids of Gaul came to Britain to learn, indicating that Britain was regarded as the source and centre of the Druidic tradition, a tradition of learning and philosophy that Caesar himself acknowledged as intellectually serious. He describes the population as numerous, with many buildings not unlike those of the Gauls, and large numbers of cattle. But Caesar does not describe Stonehenge. He does not describe Avebury. He does not describe Silbury Hill or the Ring of Brodgar or any of the megalithic monuments that were visible and intact across the British landscape when he arrived. This is a deliberate silence, and deliberate silences in ancient sources are always interesting. The most likely explanation is not that Caesar did not see these monuments. It is that he did not know what to say about them, or that what he might have said was too disturbing to commit to the kind of official record that the Gallic Wars represents. Caesar was writing a political and military document, a justification of his campaigns, and a demonstration of Roman power. Acknowledging the existence of monuments that dwarfed anything the Roman world had built, created by people his audience would have expected to be primitive barbarians, would have been deeply inconvenient. The Roman literary tradition around Britain does contain traces of the astonishment that the physical reality of the island produced. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE based on sources that included the account of Pythias, describes a circular temple of great size on a northern island that the sun god is said to visit every 19 years. This is almost certainly Stonehenge, and the detail about the 19-year cycle is a direct reference to the Metonic cycle, the astronomical cycle of 18 to 19 years, after which the sun and moon return to the same relative positions, and which is closely related to the lunar cycle encoded at Callanish and other British megalithic sites. The people Diodorus was drawing on knew that the circular temple had a connection to a 19-year astronomical cycle, and they recorded it. The British peoples, or their priestly class, were still aware of the astronomical significance of their monuments, at least into the period when Pythias visited, around 320 BCE. Pomponius Mela, writing in the mid-1st century CE, describes the Druids as teaching in hidden places and caves, a description that may preserve a memory of the use of natural or artificial chambers, perhaps the long barrows or similar monuments, as spaces for the transmission of knowledge. The Druids are consistently described in Roman sources as possessing extensive learning, including knowledge of astronomy, natural philosophy, and a belief in the transmigration of souls that struck Roman observers as philosophically sophisticated, even when they found it barbarically expressed. Strabo notes that the Druids studied natural and moral philosophy. Cicero, who met a Druid named Diviciacus in Rome, described him as knowledgeable about augury and the natural world. Caesar himself, despite his hostility to the Druids as a political force, acknowledges that they spend 20 years memorizing a vast body of knowledge that they refused to commit to writing. 20 years. The training period of a Druid was 20 years of oral memorization of a body of knowledge so large that it required that investment of time to master. What was in that body of knowledge? Caesar says it concerned the stars, the universe, the nature of things, and the power of the immortal gods. The Roman world had its own astronomers and philosophers, so the existence of astronomical and philosophical knowledge in Britain was not what astonished them. What seems to have astonished them, and what they struggled to articulate in their written sources, was the combination. A society that appeared, by Roman standards, to lack the markers of civilization, living in roundhouses rather than cities, without a written literature, without a formal legal system recognizable to Roman eyes, and yet possessing a body of intellectual and spiritual knowledge that commanded respect from educated Romans who encountered it face to face. The Druidic knowledge system was not the innovation of the Iron Age Celts, who dominate the conventional picture of pre-Roman Britain. It was the inheritor and transmitter of something far older, a tradition of learning about the sky, the landscape, the relationship between human communities, and the natural world that had been accumulating on the British Isles since the Neolithic. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the megalithic monuments was not forgotten when those monuments were built and used. It was incorporated into a living tradition of oral learning and kept alive across millennia by the specialist class that later Roman observers called the Druids, but that had almost certainly existed, under other names and in other forms, for as long as the monuments themselves. Consider the implications of this. If Stonehenge was built around 2500 BCE, and if the astronomical knowledge it encodes was part of a continuous tradition of learning that survived to the era of Roman contact, then that tradition had been alive for approximately 2,500 years. 2,500 years of accumulated astronomical observation, refined mathematical understanding, and sustained intellectual culture, carried in the memories of a specialist class across uncountable generations. The tradition of learning that the Romans encountered in Britain and found simultaneously impressive and threatening was not a new development. It was the living continuation of the intellectual culture that had built the monuments they could see on every hillside and plain. This is what terrified the Romans, not the physical monuments themselves, though those were impressive enough. What terrified them was the recognition, which they could not fully articulate, because it contradicted too many of their assumptions about civilization, that the island of Britain had been home to a sophisticated, sustained, intellectually serious civilization for thousands of years before Rome existed. That the people they were conquering were not primitive barbarians stumbling into the light of Roman civilization. That they were, in a very real sense, the descendants and inheritors of something older and in some ways more impressive than Rome itself. And that the knowledge embedded in that tradition, the understanding of the sky, the long memory of the landscape, the philosophical frameworks that made sense of the relationship between human life and the cosmic order, was not going to be easily erased by the arrival of legions. The Roman response to British sacred culture was not simply to suppress it. The suppression of the Druids, which reached its most violent expression in the massacre of the Druids at Mona, the island of Anglesey, in 60 CE, as described by Tacitus, was preceded by decades of political manipulation, co-optation, and the strategic undermining of Druidic authority. The Romans were experienced in managing conquered peoples who had strong religious and intellectual traditions. They had done it in Gaul, in Spain, in the Eastern Mediterranean. But in Britain, they encountered a tradition with such deep roots, such wide social authority, and such genuine intellectual prestige that the conventional Roman approach of selective absorption into the Roman religious framework was insufficient. The Druids had to be destroyed as a functioning institution because they were too powerful and too coherent to be simply repackaged as Roman priests of a renamed deity. What were they afraid of? What specifically about the Druidic tradition made the Roman administration of Britain treat it as an existential threat to the project of Romanization? The answer has several components. First, the Druids were the memory keepers of Britain. They held in their trained memories the genealogies, the legal traditions, the historical records, the philosophical frameworks, and the astronomical knowledge of a civilization that predated Rome by thousands of years. As long as the Druids existed and transmitted their knowledge, an alternative framework of authority, meaning, and identity existed alongside the Roman one. Second, the Druids were supra-tribal. They operated across the tribal divisions of British Celtic society, moving freely between tribes as a neutral class with authority recognized by all. This made them potentially capable of organizing resistance across tribal boundaries, a capability that Roman divide and rule strategy was specifically designed to prevent. Third, the Druids performed a function in British society that the Romans recognized as analogous to that of their own priestly and legal classes, but with the crucial difference that it was indigenous, ancient, and deeply embedded in a landscape that was visibly saturated with the monuments of thousands of years of accumulated sacred practice. When Tacitus describes the Roman assault on the Druids at Anglesey, He records something that his Roman audience was clearly expected to find striking. He describes the Druids as standing on the shore as the Roman soldiers crossed to the island, their hands raised to heaven, pouring out dreadful curses. He describes women in black running between the ranks like furies, brandishing torches. He describes the Roman soldiers as seized by a sudden paralysis, standing motionless while the enemy's strange appearance overcame them. And then he describes Agricola urging them not to be terrified by a troop of women and fanatics, and the Romans advancing and cutting down all they meet, wrapping the enemy in their own flames. It is a Roman victory narrative, but read against the grain. It is also the account of a moment at which even the most disciplined soldiers of the most powerful military in the Western world felt the force of something genuinely other, something connected to a tradition so ancient and so deeply rooted in its landscape that it retained the capacity to cause psychological disruption even in men who had conquered most of the known world. The sacred groves of the Druids were another target of Roman suppression. Julius Caesar mentions that the Druids used sacred groves for their most important rituals, and Roman sources consistently connect the Druids with specific landscape locations, springs, caves, hilltops, and forests that served as the ritual centers of their tradition. These locations were not random. Many of them were the same places that had been ritual centers for the megalithic civilization thousands of years before the Iron Age Celts arrived. The spring at Bath, dedicated in the Celtic period to the goddess Sulis, was venerated as a sacred site long before any Celtic presence in Britain. The deposits of votive objects found at the bottom of the spring, dating from the Bronze Age and possibly earlier, show a continuous tradition of sacred practice at the same location stretching back thousands of years. The Romans, characteristically, did not destroy this location. They built a temple over it, dedicated to Sulis Minerva, co-opting the local deity by identifying her with a Roman one. But the practice of throwing votive offerings into the spring continued through the Roman period with remarkable continuity, demonstrating that the sacred geography of prehistoric Britain was not so easily erased, even by the administrative machinery of Rome. This is a pattern visible across Roman Britain. The locations that had been sacred in the Neolithic and Bronze Age continued to be sacred through the Iron Age and into the Roman period. The landscape of prehistoric Britain was not a blank slate onto which different successive cultures projected their own meanings independently. It was a palimpsest, a document written and rewritten over thousands of years, in which each new layer of meaning was inscribed over and partly through the existing ones. The Romans wrote their layer on top of what the Celts had written, which was on top of what the Bronze Age people had written, which was on top of what the Neolithic megalith builders had written. But the earliest layer, the deepest inscription, remained legible beneath all the others, expressed in the physical fabric of monuments that were too massive and too numerous to demolish. The Silbury Hill that the Romans saw had been there for over 2,000 years when they arrived. Stonehenge had been there for over a millennium in its final form, and the original earthwork had been there for 1,500 years. The Avebury Henge had been there for 700 years. These were not ancient ruins in the Roman period. They were, in many cases, still in use, still being visited, still being incorporated into the ritual practices of the people who lived around them. And they were a constant, visible, unavoidable reminder that the civilization Rome was claiming to enlighten had its own deep history, its own accumulated wisdom, its own relationship with the cosmos, that predated Rome by an embarrassingly long margin. The Romans were not stupid. They knew what they were seeing, and some of them left traces in the written record of their discomfort with the implications. The geographer Strabo, who wrote about Britain without ever visiting it, admitted that the island was surrounded by difficulty to understand, a phrase that carries a weight of intellectual anxiety if you read it in context. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, describes the Druids as having such great prestige as to make them seem like the Magi of the Persians, connecting them to the most respected intellectual and spiritual tradition of the ancient Eastern world. This is not the description of a primitive ritual priesthood. This is the description of a tradition of learning and wisdom that a sophisticated Roman observer felt compelled to compare to the most admired intellectual tradition outside the classical world. And it is Pliny who records one of the most striking pieces of evidence for the antiquity and sophistication of the British tradition. He notes that the Druids of Britain held the oak in particular reverence, and that their name itself might be connected to the Greek word for oak, a connection he does not press too hard, because its implications are uncomfortable. If the Druidic tradition had a name connected to the Greek word for oak, it suggests contact between the Druidic intellectual tradition and the Greek-speaking world at a date sufficiently early for that linguistic connection to have formed. This does not require us to posit any kind of direct influence or derivation in either direction. It may simply reflect the fact that the sacred status of the oak in European tradition is extremely old, predating both the Greek and the Celtic cultural spheres, and that both preserved their own versions of a much more ancient reverence. But its significance lies in the direction it points, toward a shared intellectual heritage of the European prehistoric world that is far older than the named cultures we think of as the founders of European civilization. The pre-Roman Iron Age in Britain, the period from around 700 BCE to the Roman conquest in 43 CE, is the period we most commonly associate with the Celts. And there is no question that the Iron Age peoples of Britain spoke Celtic languages, used Celtic art styles, participated in the broader Celtic cultural sphere of northwestern Europe, and maintained the kinds of social organization, the warrior aristocracies, the tribal structures, the Druidic intellectual class that Roman observers describe. But the idea that the Celts simply arrived in Britain around 800 BCE and founded a new civilization on an empty or culturally blank landscape is no longer supportable. The Celtic cultural forms were adopted by, or imposed on, a population that already had several thousand years of cultural, intellectual, and spiritual development behind it. The brilliant Latin art style that characterizes the British Iron Age, with its swirling plant-based motifs, its dynamic tension between representation and abstraction, its extraordinary metalwork, was not a foreign importation applied to a neutral substrate. It was developed in interaction with an existing aesthetic tradition that had been producing abstract decoration, geometric patterns, and sophisticated visual expression for millennia before the Latin style crystallized. The iron swords and shields of the British Iron Age warrior aristocracy were decorated with patterns that, if you trace their visual logic back far enough, connect to the geometric decoration of Neolithic pottery and the carved spirals of megalithic monuments. The swirling patterns on the Battersea shield or the Waterloo helmet are not simply Celtic art imposed on a British canvas. They are the latest expression of a visual tradition that began in the British Neolithic, passed through the Beaker and Bronze Age periods, and found its mature flowering in the metalwork of the Iron Age, under the influence of continental Celtic aesthetic forms. The people making and using these objects were not simply transplanted Celts. They were the descendants, cultural and in many cases biological, of the people who had been developing visual art on this island for 5,000 years. This is the civilization that terrified the Romans. Not the individual artifacts, however impressive, not the individual monuments, however overwhelming, but the combination, the physical evidence of a depth of history that made Roman civilization look recent, the intellectual tradition that preserved and transmitted the knowledge encoded in that history, and the stubborn persistence of a sacred geography that organized the entire British landscape into a system of meaning that resisted Roman redescription. The Romans could build roads through Britain, they could build towns, they could establish administrative systems, they could impose taxation and law, but they could not make Stonehenge stop being Stonehenge. They could not make the Avebury ditch fill in. They could not make Silbury Hill disappear. And as long as those structures stood, the alternative story they embodied, the story of a civilization older and in some ways wiser than Rome, remained visible to anyone with the capacity to read the landscape. The genetic picture that modern science has built of prehistoric Britain adds another layer to this story. The ancient DNA evidence has transformed our understanding of the demographic history of the island in ways that are still being processed and debated. We know that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who were in Britain before the Neolithic farmers were of a type broadly similar to other Western European hunter-gatherers, with dark skin, blue or green eyes, and brown or dark hair. The famous Cheddar Man, whose genome was analyzed in 2018 and whose features were reconstructed from his skull, represents this population. He dates to around 7000 BCE and shows the ancestral type of the people who were in Britain before the farming revolution. These people were not replaced by the incoming Neolithic farmers entirely. They contributed their genes to the mixed population that emerged from the Neolithic transition, meaning that some portion of the indigenous Mesolithic British DNA persisted into the people who built Stonehenge and Avebury. The Beaker replacement, as noted earlier, was the most dramatic demographic event in British prehistory. The incoming population brought with them a completely different genetic profile, including the genes associated with lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, which is one of the most striking adaptations associated with pastoralist populations from the Pontic steppe. This genetic adaptation became near universal in the British population after the Beaker transition, which is one of the reasons why dairy farming has been so central to British agriculture ever since. The bodies of the people of prehistoric Britain were changed by the incoming population, and the incoming population was changed by the landscape and the cultural frameworks they encountered on arrival. By the Iron Age, the population of Britain was a complex genetic mixture of multiple waves of migration and local development, and identifying any of them as simply Celtic or simply indigenous in the genetic sense is impossible. The culture of Iron Age Britain was Celtic in its language, in many of its art forms, in elements of its social organization. But the people who carried that culture were genetically diverse, and the cultural heritage they expressed was layered with contributions from multiple periods and multiple populations, going back to the very first inhabitants of the island after the last ice age. The Hillforts of Iron Age Britain are another expression of this layered civilization. Britain has more Hillforts per square kilometre than anywhere else in Europe, with estimates ranging from 3,000 to 4,000 surviving examples. These are defended settlements, built on hilltops and promontories across the length and breadth of the island, surrounded by multiple banks and ditches that represent formidable obstacles to attackers. The largest of them, such as Maiden Castle in Dorset, are of staggering scale. Maiden Castle occupies an area of around 47 acres, enclosed within multiple banks and ditches that reach heights of over 20 meters in places. The outer perimeter of the earthworks is nearly 3 kilometers long. The labor required to construct and maintain Maiden Castle was comparable to that required for the major Neolithic henges, and Maiden Castle is not unique. Hillforts of comparable scale and complexity are found across Britain from Cornwall to Northumberland. The Romans found the Hillforts of Britain formidable military obstacles, but they eventually developed the techniques and the will to overcome them. The massacre at Maiden Castle, evidenced by the war cemetery discovered there by Mortimer Wheeler in the 1930s, shows the violence that accompanied the Roman conquest of some of these sites. Ballista bolts were found embedded in the spines of defenders, and the burials in the war cemetery include individuals with catastrophic injuries inflicted by Roman weapons. But the Hillforts were not just military structures. They were towns. They were centers of manufacture, trade, storage, and social life. The excavated interiors of major Hillforts show roundhouses, storage pits, evidence of metalworking, pottery production, textile manufacture, and the full range of activities associated with permanent, organized settlement. They were the urban centers of a civilization that organized itself on principles different from the Roman grid, but no less effectively. The coinage of the British Iron Age is another indicator of the sophistication of pre-Roman British civilization that is often overlooked. British tribes began minting their own coins from around 150 BCE, initially in imitation of coins from the Greek world that reached Britain through trade networks, but gradually developing distinctly British styles that departed significantly from their prototypes. The abstract, swirling, sometimes bewildering designs of British Iron Age coins, in which the horse, the chariot, and the human head are the dominant motifs, but are broken apart and reassembled in ways that bear only a loose relationship to realistic representation, represent a deliberate artistic tradition with its own internal logic. These are not primitive imitations of a technology not fully understood. They are sophisticated artistic expressions of a worldview in which reality is not fixed and stable but fluid and interconnected, in which the boundary between the human and the animal, the natural and the supernatural, is permeable and interesting. The existence of British coinage also tells us something about the economic sophistication of Iron Age Britain. You do not develop a coinage system unless you have an economy complex enough to require it. Markets, trade, debt, credit, political payment, tribute, and gift exchange, at a scale too large to manage through direct barter, all drive the adoption of coinage. The tribes of Iron Age Britain who minted their own coins were operating within economic systems of considerable complexity, involving long-distance trade, agricultural surplus, specialist manufacture, and political economics, sophisticated enough to require a standardized medium of exchange. The Greek geographer and traveller Pytheas, who sailed around Britain around 320 BCE, left an account, now known only through quotations and paraphrases in later sources, that describes a Britain of abundant grain, of tin mining and trading, of a population with habits of hospitality towards strangers, and of extraordinary natural phenomena, including the tidal range of the Atlantic coast, which Pytheas seems to have been the first Greek observer to connect correctly to the influence of the moon. The Britain Pytheas describes is not a land of naked savages scratching at the soil. It is a land of organized agriculture, established trade, social customs governing the treatment of visitors, and a population sufficiently in contact with the Mediterranean world to be familiar, at least in the coastal areas, with the existence of Greek traders. Pytheas was able to navigate around Britain, which means he found people who could guide him, which means the coastal populations were not hostile to strangers, with the capacity to provide useful information. The tin traders, who connected Britain to the Phoenician and Greek worlds, were part of a much larger pattern of long-distance exchange that made Britain not a peripheral backwater, but a significant node in the trading networks of the ancient Atlantic world. The Atlantic facade of Europe, from Morocco to Norway, was connected by sea routes that predate the Roman period by thousands of years. British Bronze Age metalwork has been found in France, in Iberia, in Scandinavia. Scandinavian amber has been found in British Bronze Age graves. Irish gold was distributed across Britain and into continental Europe in the Bronze Age. Mediterranean faience beads reached Britain in the early Bronze Age, indicating connections that reached as far as the eastern Mediterranean before the Greek or Phoenician trading expeditions that are historically documented. Britain was not on the edge of the ancient world. It was at the western end of one of the most active maritime trading zones in the prehistoric Atlantic, connected by sea to communities from Ireland to Brittany to Iberia to Scandinavia. The knowledge, the materials, and the ideas that flowed along these routes shaped British culture at every period, from the Neolithic onward. And the reverse was also true. British ideas, British materials, and British people flowed outward along the same routes and influenced the cultures they reached. The spread of megalithic architecture itself, which appears in Britain, Ireland, France, Iberia, the Mediterranean islands, and as far as Malta, may reflect the movement of ideas and perhaps people along the Atlantic maritime network. The cultural logic that produced Stonehenge was not an isolated local phenomenon. It was part of a broader Atlantic tradition that connected the far western edge of Europe in a web of shared practice and shared meaning that the later, more documented history of the classical world tends to obscure. What happened to all of this after the Roman conquest? The answer is complex, partial, and in some ways encouraging. The Roman conquest of Britain, completed formally under Claudius from 43 CE and extended progressively northward over the following decades, did not destroy the civilization it encountered. It transformed it. The tribal aristocracies of Britain were incorporated into the Roman administrative system. Their leaders became Roman citizens. Their towns were overlaid with Roman grid plans, forums, baths, and temples. Their languages did not disappear immediately, and the Latin that spread across Roman Britain was always a language used alongside, not simply replacing, the Celtic languages of the population. The sacred sites were co-opted rather than destroyed in most cases. Their deities merged with Roman counterparts in a process of interpretatio Romana that simultaneously acknowledged the power of the local tradition and attempted to reframe it within Roman categories. But the megalithic monuments were not co-opted. They were too old, too large, too deeply embedded in the landscape and in the memory of the population to be easily reframed. The Romans built their roads without reference to the Neolithic landscape in most cases, laying their straight lines across a territory already organized by thousands of years of human use. But the old centers of the landscape persisted. People continued to visit Stonehenge in the Roman period. Roman coins and pottery have been found at Stonehenge, indicating that it remained a place of human activity, possibly of pilgrimage or continued ritual significance, into the Roman period. The Avebury landscape shows evidence of Roman period activity. Silbury Hill was incorporated into a Roman road network, with a road running around its base, suggesting that the Romans treated it as a fixed point in the landscape, worthy of road engineering rather than as an obstacle to be demolished. And in the north, in Scotland beyond the frontier, that eventually stabilized along Hadrian's Wall and then the Antonine Wall, the Roman conquest did not reach. The people of what is now Scotland maintained their independence throughout the Roman period, and with it, maintained their cultural traditions in a more direct and unbroken way than the Romanized South. The Pictish culture that would emerge in Scotland in the post-Roman period, with its extraordinary carved stones bearing abstract symbols of unknown meaning, may represent the latest expression of a visual and symbolic tradition that goes back to the Neolithic. The Pictish symbols, which include crescents, mirrors, combs, and a range of complex geometric forms, are not connected to any known Celtic or Roman artistic tradition. They appear, apparently fully formed, in the post-Roman period, and they resist all attempts at straightforward interpretation. They may be a late flowering of the indigenous symbolic tradition of northern Britain, a tradition that had been developing for 5,000 years before the Romans arrived. The population of Roman Britain was not racially or culturally homogeneous. The Roman army that garrisoned the island was drawn from across the empire, and the civilian populations that grew up around the military installations included people from North Africa, the Middle East, the Rhine frontier, the Danube frontier, and every other part of the Roman world. A letter from the Vindolanda tablets, the extraordinary collection of wooden writing tablets found at a fort near Hadrian's Wall, refers to Britunculi, a diminutive and slightly contemptuous term for the local British people, the Little Britons who were seen by Roman soldiers from other parts of the empire as a distinct and somewhat separate group. This term is fascinating because it suggests that the Roman soldiers stationed in Britain saw the indigenous British population not as Romans who happened to live in Britain, but as a distinct people with their own characteristics, their own ways, their own persistent identity, that resisted complete absorption into the Roman cultural framework. That persistent identity was grounded in the landscape and in the memory of what the landscape contained. The monuments were still there, the sacred sites were still there. The oral traditions that connected the living population to the history of those sites were still there, carried in the memories of individuals who had not been converted into Roman citizens and were not planning to be. The deep history of Britain was not lost when the Romans arrived. It was driven underground, coded into the forms of a culture that increasingly had to coexist with Roman administration while maintaining its own frameworks of meaning in spaces and modes that the Roman system could not easily penetrate. It is worth pausing here to consider the question of why any of this matters now. Why should we care about a civilization that ended, in its recognizable form, 5,000 years ago? Why does it matter that the people who built Stonehenge were more sophisticated than we thought? Why does the fact that the Romans were disturbed by the evidence of British antiquity have any relevance to the present? It matters for several reasons. It matters because the conventional narrative of British history, which begins effectively with the Romans and treats everything before as prologue at best, primitive prehistory at worst, is wrong. It is factually wrong, and the evidence to correct it has been accumulating for decades. Accepting the correction means accepting that the island of Britain has been home to sophisticated, intellectually serious, culturally rich, astronomically knowledgeable, and organizationally capable civilizations for at least as long as the most celebrated civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean world. This is not a marginal claim. It is the straightforward conclusion of a century of archaeological work, and it has profound implications for how we understand the origins of the knowledge traditions that underlie modern Western civilization. It also matters because the methods by which the story of pre-Roman Britain has been minimized, simplified, and distorted, tell us something important about how history is constructed and for what purposes. The Victorian framework that produced the standard narrative of British prehistory as a story of progressive advance from primitive savagery to Roman civilization was not a neutral description of the evidence. It was a politically motivated construction that served the interests of a society that was itself engaged in empire building and needed a story about civilization that justified the idea that some peoples needed to be brought civilization from outside because they were incapable of developing it themselves. The evidence of the megalithic civilization of Britain sat awkwardly within that framework because it demonstrated clearly and physically and in structures that were impossible to dismiss that a non-literate, non-urban, pre-Roman society had achieved levels of intellectual and organizational sophistication that did not fit the model of civilizational hierarchy the Victorian framework required. The correction of that framework is not just an academic matter. It is an act of historical justice toward the people whose achievements were minimized, and it is an act of intellectual honesty toward the evidence those achievements left in the landscape. The landscape of Britain is itself a primary document for this history. Walk from Stonehenge to Avebury, across the chalk downs of Wiltshire, and you are walking through a landscape that was organized for human purposes 5,000 years ago. The paths, the hillforts, the barrows, the field systems, the water sources, the viewpoints from which one monument is visible from another, all of this is a record of how the people of prehistoric Britain understood and organized their world. The landscape is a text written in stone and earth, and learning to read it requires not just technical archaeological knowledge, but a willingness to take seriously the intelligence and the intentionality of the people who wrote it. The archaeologist Christopher Tilley, whose work on phenomenological archaeology in the 1990s was groundbreaking, if controversial, argued that the monuments of prehistoric Britain can only be properly understood in the context of the landscape experience they were designed to produce. The long barrows of the Cotswolds, for example, are aligned in ways that produce specific visual relationships with the surrounding hills and valleys when you approach them from the directions that ritual practice probably dictated. The experience of moving through the landscape toward a monument, of arriving at a specific vantage point from which the monument suddenly comes into view against a particular skyline, of entering the monument and experiencing the deliberate manipulation of light and space that its architecture creates. All of this was part of the meaning of the monument. It cannot be recovered from excavation reports alone. It has to be walked. This kind of understanding, this reading of the landscape as an intentional communicative system, is deeply compatible with the Druidic tradition of knowledge transmission through practice, through the body, through movement, through specific spaces in the natural world. The 20 years of oral learning that a Druid underwent was not abstract book learning. It was the embodied acquisition of a comprehensive framework for understanding the relationship between human life and the natural world, expressed through the movement of celestial bodies, the behavior of plants and animals, the memory of the landscape, and the stories embedded in specific places. It was, in the most literal sense, the kind of knowledge that cannot be written down because it is not propositional. It is experiential. It lives in the body of the person who has acquired it, and it dies with them unless it is transmitted to another body through the same process of experiential learning. This is precisely the kind of knowledge that writing destroys. The Roman historian who noted that the Druids refused to commit their learning to writing and speculated that this was because they did not want their knowledge to become common property was missing the point. The Druids refused to write their knowledge down because writing it down would have killed it. The knowledge only existed in its living, embodied, practiced form. A written account of how to read a landscape the way a trained Druid read it would be like a written account of how to ride a bicycle, technically accurate, utterly useless as a substitute for the actual experience. The Roman literate tradition could not comprehend a form of knowledge that was not, at least in principle, reducible to text. And because it could not comprehend it could not preserve it, and it contributed, through the suppression of the Druidic institution, to its loss. We have been recovering pieces of it ever since. The revival of interest in megalithic monuments from the 17th century onward, the astronomical interpretations of Stonehenge that began in the 18th century with the work of William Stukeley, the archaeological investigations that accelerated through the 19th and 20th centuries, and the extraordinary revelations of modern scientific techniques, including ancient DNA analysis, LiDAR landscape survey, and isotope analysis of human and animal remains, are all part of a long process of recovering what was suppressed and forgotten. We are not finished recovering it. The Ness of Brodgar has been excavated for only a fraction of its extent. LiDAR surveys continue to reveal new monuments, new field systems, and new landscape features that were invisible from the ground. Ancient DNA analysis is yielding new results from sites across Britain every year. The story is not complete. What we can say with confidence is this. Before the Celts arrived in Britain, and before the Beaker migrants who demographically preceded them, and before the Neolithic farmers who brought agriculture to the island, and before the first permanent settlements of the post-Ice Age Mesolithic period, there were people here, and those people, and the ones who came after them, built something that lasted. They built it in stone and earth, and in the memories of trained minds. They built a relationship with the sky and the landscape that was sophisticated enough to produce Stonehenge and Callanish and Newgrange. They built economic and social systems capable of mobilizing the labor and coordinating the logistics necessary to move 80 stones from Wales to Wiltshire. They built intellectual traditions capable of sustaining astronomical observation and mathematical calculation across generations and millennia. And when the Romans came, the most powerful military civilization the Western world had produced, looked at what the people of Britain had built, and felt something they did not have adequate words for, because it was a feeling the Roman world was not supposed to experience in the presence of barbarians. It was awe. It was the vertigo of encountering evidence of deep time, of recognizing that the people they were claiming to civilize had been thinking seriously about the cosmos, the landscape, and the relationship between human life and the natural order for far longer than Rome had existed. It was the discovery, which they suppressed as effectively as they could in their written records, but could not suppress in the physical evidence of the landscape, that civilization is not a single line from primitive to advanced, from dark to light, from ignorance to knowledge. It is a manifold of different forms, different emphases, different achievements, and that the people of the British Isles had been one of the more remarkable expressions of human civilizational potential for a very long time before anyone from Rome set foot on their shores. The stones are still there, the earthworks are still there. The alignments with the winter solstice sunset and the summer solstice sunrise are still mathematically precise. The landscape still reads, to anyone willing to learn its language, as a text of extraordinary depth and richness. And the people who wrote that text were not primitive. They were not barbarians awaiting civilization from outside. They were the inheritors and developers of a tradition of human intellectual achievement as old as farming itself, as sophisticated in its own terms as anything the classical world produced, and as worthy of the awe the Romans felt, but could not bring themselves to fully acknowledge. That is the civilization that was in Britain before the Romans arrived. That is the civilization that was here before the Celts, and before the Beaker people, and before the Neolithic farmers, in its deepest roots, reaching back to the first human beings who walked onto this island after the ice, retreated, and made it their home. And it is a civilization whose traces are still legible in the landscape, still recoverable through science and archaeology and careful attention, and still capable of producing in anyone who looks at it with open eyes that same vertigo that the Roman legions felt when they marched across the chalk downs of Wiltshire and saw, rising from the plain, the silent testimony of Stonehenge. The question of why the knowledge of pre-Roman Britain was systematically minimized is as important as the knowledge itself. The erasure did not begin with the Romans. It began much later, in the period of early modern European scholarship, when the frameworks for understanding human history were being constructed from scratch using a combination of classical texts, biblical chronology, and the very early stages of what would become archaeology. The scholars who built those frameworks in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were not simply reporting on neutral evidence. They were constructing narratives that served specific cultural and political purposes, and the evidence of prehistoric Britain was a problem for those narratives in ways that drove its systematic reinterpretation toward the most primitive possible reading. John Aubrey, the 17th century English antiquarian, who was the first to seriously document both Stonehenge and Avebury in a systematic way, came closer than most of his contemporaries to recognizing the true significance of what he was describing. His unpublished manuscript, Monumenta Britannica, contains observations about the stone circles and earthworks of Britain that were remarkably perceptive for their time, connecting them to a pre-Roman tradition of religious practice and acknowledging the extraordinary scale of the effort required to build them. Aubrey was not a professional scholar in any modern sense. He was a curious, well-connected, financially unreliable gentleman whose instinct for the significance of landscape features was unmatched in his generation. He identified Avebury as more significant than Stonehenge, at a time when Stonehenge already had the cultural prestige that Avebury lacked, and he was right. He proposed that the stone circles were temples of the Druids, at a time when this connection was speculative, and while the connection is now complicated by the chronological gap between the Druidic tradition and the megalithic monuments, the intuition that both were expressions of the same deep indigenous British tradition was not entirely wrong. William Stukeley, who followed in Aubrey's footsteps in the early 18th century and published the first detailed descriptions of both Stonehenge and Avebury, was a more complex figure. His observations were meticulous, and his drawings were invaluable records of monuments that were already being damaged by agricultural activity and stone robbing. But Stukeley also constructed an elaborate romantic mythology of the Druids that owed more to his own imagination and to his desire to reconcile prehistoric Britain with the Christianity of his time than to any genuine evidence. He created the image of the Druid as a philosopher-priest of the oak groves, a benevolent sage whose wisdom anticipated Christian revelation, and this image proved so powerful that it persisted in popular culture for 2 centuries and continues to generate confusion about the actual nature of the Druidic tradition. The damage done by the romantic Druid image was substantial. By linking the megalithic monuments to a fictionalized, quasi-Christian version of Druidism, Stukeley inadvertently made it easier for subsequent scholarship to dismiss both. When the chronological distance between the megalithic monuments and the Iron Age Druids became apparent in the 19th century, scholars used this discrepancy to argue not only that the Druids had nothing to do with Stonehenge, which is correct in the strict constructional sense, but that the entire tradition of serious British prehistoric culture was essentially empty, a void to be filled by external influences from more obviously sophisticated ancient civilizations. The Romans, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, and various other candidates were proposed as the real builders of the British monuments, because the alternative, that indigenous British people had built them through their own intellectual and organizational resources, seemed impossible within the framework these scholars were operating. That framework, as noted, was the Victorian framework of civilizational progress, but its roots go deeper than the Victorian period. The assumption that civilization flows from the East, from the ancient Near East, through Greece and Rome, and then northward into barbarian Europe, is embedded in the Western scholarly tradition from its very beginnings in the classical sources. Herodotus treats Egypt as the source of Greek civilization. Greek and Roman sources consistently position the peoples of the Atlantic Northwest as the barbarian periphery of a world whose center of gravity is the Mediterranean. The Celts, when they appear in classical sources, are described with a mixture of fascination and contempt as noble savages, admirable in their physical courage and their love of freedom, but lacking the reason and the discipline that the classical tradition associated with true civilization. Britain, the most peripheral of the peripheral, the island at the very edge of the known world, was supposed to be the least civilized of all. The discovery, in monument after monument, landscape after landscape, that the most peripheral was also in many respects the most ancient and the most astronomically sophisticated, was not accommodatable within this framework without fundamental revision. And fundamental revision of a foundational framework is always deeply uncomfortable, always resisted, always slow. We are still in the process of that revision. The tools we have now to carry it out are incomparably better than anything available to previous generations of scholars. LiDAR technology, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging, uses laser pulses fired from aircraft to create extraordinarily detailed, three-dimensional maps of the ground surface, penetrating tree cover and other vegetation to reveal features invisible to conventional aerial photography. Since its application to British landscape archaeology in the early years of the 21st century, LiDAR has transformed our knowledge of the prehistoric landscape. Features that were unknown, invisible at ground level, and undetectable from conventional aircraft have emerged in their hundreds from LiDAR surveys across Britain. New monuments, new field systems, new settlement patterns, new landscape relationships between known monuments that were impossible to see when you could only examine parts of the landscape at a time. The Stonehenge landscape, as revealed by LiDAR surveys in the past decade, is incomparably richer than the Stonehenge landscape as understood even 20 years ago. A LiDAR survey of the area around Stonehenge, published in 2014, revealed over 60 previously unknown monuments in the vicinity of the site, including a massive timber structure that may have served as a stadium or viewing platform for ritual events at the monument. The Durrington Walls complex, a large Neolithic settlement and henge monument about 3 kilometers from Stonehenge, was revealed by LiDAR and subsequent excavation to be considerably more extensive and more complex than previously understood. The settlement associated with Durrington Walls, which dates to around 2500 BCE and was contemporaneous with the construction of the Sarsen phase of Stonehenge, is now believed to have been the largest settlement in Neolithic Britain, potentially housing thousands of people during the construction seasons of the Great Monument. These were not scattered farming communities individually, contributing a little labour. These were large, organised communities coming together in a deliberate, planned, sustained cooperative effort of extraordinary scale. The construction season evidence from Durrington Walls is particularly revealing. Analysis of the animal bones from the settlement shows that the cattle and pigs being consumed were being killed in midwinter. The isotope analysis of those animal bones shows that the cattle had been grazed in different parts of Britain and brought specifically to Durrington Walls for slaughter and consumption. This is a picture of a deliberate, planned, logistically sophisticated assembly. Animals transported from across Britain to a central location to feed the workforce during the winter construction season. The organizational infrastructure required to plan this, to coordinate the collection and transport of animals from across the island, to house and feed thousands of workers through the winter, and to direct their labor in the precision construction of a monument like Stonehenge, is not the infrastructure of a primitive agrarian society. It is the infrastructure of a sophisticated state-level, or at minimum, chiefdom-level political organization, with the capacity to command resources and coordinate labor across a wide geographic area. The isotope analysis of human remains from the area around Stonehenge tells a similar story. Individuals buried in the vicinity of Stonehenge during the main construction period show a wide geographic spread of origins, their teeth reflecting the geology of regions across Britain rather than the local chalk of Wiltshire. People came from Wales, from the north of England, from Scotland, from Cornwall and the southwest to participate in the Great Project. This is not an accidental gathering. This is a pilgrimage, a deliberately organized mobilization of people from across the island around a project of such cultural and religious significance that it overrode local and regional differences in identity. The people who came to Stonehenge to work on its construction did not all come from the same tribe, speak the same dialect, or understand the project in exactly the same terms, but they came, and they built. The complexity of Stonehenge as an engineering project is worth dwelling on because it is still not fully appreciated in popular accounts. The Sarsen stones, the massive sandstone blocks that form the iconic trilithons and the outer circle, were transported from Marlborough Downs, around 25 miles to the north, but the route was not a straight line. The stones had to be brought around geological obstacles, across rivers, and through a landscape of considerable topographical variety. The largest of the upright stones weighs around 25 tons. Moving a 25-ton stone with Neolithic technology using wooden sledges and rollers, requires a labor force of potentially several hundred people for a single stone, organized and directed, with precision, to prevent the stone from veering off course or crushing the workers who were managing it. The finishing of the sarsen stones at Stonehenge is itself an extraordinary technical achievement. The surfaces of the upright stones were dressed smooth, using hammerstones to pound away the rough natural surface of the sandstone over large areas of the stone face. The lintels were shaped with deliberate curves on their outer face to match the curvature of the circle they formed, so that the outer face of the completed circle was a perfect arc rather than a series of flat-faced segments. This is precision work at a monumental scale, requiring the kind of geometric understanding that allows a craftsman to calculate how much material to remove from each part of a lintel face to produce a specific curve when the lintel is in position 20 meters above the ground. And the mortise and tenon joints that locked the lintels to the uprights, and the tongue and groove joints that locked adjacent lintels to each other, required the matching of carved features across massive stone surfaces with tolerances that, given the weight of the stones involved, had no margin for error. Who taught these people how to do this? This is the question that the conventional narrative cannot answer, because within that narrative there is no predecessor tradition advanced enough to have passed these techniques on. The answer, which the evidence actually supports, is that the tradition of precision stoneworking developed in Britain itself, out of the long experience with megalithic construction that began in the Neolithic, with the shaping of orthostats for long barrows and passage graves. The people who built Stonehenge were not inventing precision stoneworking from scratch. They were the heirs of a tradition of working with large stones that had been developing in Britain and Ireland for over 1,000 years before the sarsen phase of Stonehenge was begun. The precision of Stonehenge represents not the arrival of an external technique, but the culmination of a long indigenous trajectory of development. Newgrange in Ireland, which, while technically outside Britain, is part of the same Atlantic megalithic tradition and cannot be left out of any comprehensive account, illustrates this developmental trajectory beautifully. Newgrange is a passage tomb, built around 200 BCE on a ridge above the River Boyne in County Meath. It consists of a large circular mound covering a passage of 19 metres, leading to a cruciform chamber, all constructed from large stone slabs. The mound originally had an outer facing of white quartz and dark granite cobbles, giving it a dramatically visible appearance in the landscape. The corbelled roof of the inner chamber, in which large flat stones are laid in successive courses that project progressively inward until they meet at the top, has remained waterproof for 5,000 years without any mortar or jointing material. The precision of the corbelling, the skill required to balance the projecting courses and calculate the inward angle required to close the vault, is extraordinary. And at the winter solstice, for about 17 days around the shortest day of the year, the light of the rising sun enters Newgrange through a specially constructed roof box above the entrance and travels along the 19-metre passage to illuminate the floor of the inner chamber for about 17 minutes. This light box is not a coincidence. It is a precisely engineered feature designed to capture the light of the rising sun on the exact days of the winter solstice. To build it, the builders had to know in advance where the rising sun would appear on the horizon at the solstice, at the exact latitude of the monument, and at the exact height of the roof box above the floor of the passage. They had to know this with enough precision to set the angle of the roof box correctly before the roof was in place, because there was no way to adjust it afterward. This required, at minimum, years of prior observation at the site to establish the precise bearing of the solstice sunrise and a method for translating that observed bearing into an architectural specification. This is the tradition that produced Stonehenge. The astronomical knowledge encoded in Newgrange, built around 200 BCE, is the same tradition of observation and architectural expression that produced the more complex and technically more demanding astronomical alignments of Stonehenge. Built over the following centuries, it is an indigenous tradition, developed within the Atlantic megalithic world, and it had reached a remarkable level of sophistication long before any influence from the literate civilizations of the ancient Near East could plausibly have reached Britain. The discovery in the 1970s and 80s that Stonehenge might have functioned as a Neolithic computer capable of predicting solar and lunar eclipses through the careful placement of markers within the monument and their systematic movement, according to a set of rules, is associated particularly with the work of the engineer Fred Hoyle and the astronomer Alexander Thom. The idea is controversial and has been debated extensively since it was first proposed. But what is not controversial is that Stonehenge is precisely oriented to solar and lunar events, and that this precision was deliberate. Whether the monument functioned as an eclipse predictor or simply as an astronomical marker of the solstices and other events, the sophistication required to produce and maintain the relevant alignments is substantial. The people who built and used Stonehenge had a systematic and detailed knowledge of astronomical cycles, and they expressed that knowledge in architecture of extraordinary technical precision. The archaeo-astronomer Clive Ruggles has spent decades studying the astronomical aspects of megalithic monuments across Britain and Ireland, and his conclusion is that the evidence for intentional astronomical orientation is strong and widespread, but that the function of these orientations was symbolic and ritualistic rather than purely scientific in the modern sense. The distinction matters. The people who built these monuments were not building observatories in the modern sense. They were building places of meaning, places where the relationship between the human community and the cosmic order was expressed, celebrated, and renewed. The astronomical alignments were the physical expression of a worldview in which the movements of the sun and moon were not just natural phenomena, but aspects of a sacred order that human communities had an obligation to acknowledge and engage with. The knowledge required to produce those alignments was scientific in the sense that it required sustained observation, pattern recognition, mathematical reasoning, and careful engineering. But the purpose to which that knowledge was put was not separate from the ritual and spiritual life of the community. It was integral to it. This integration of what we would now separate into science, religion, and art is one of the most interesting aspects of the megalithic civilization of Britain. The astronomical precision of the monuments, the abstract symbolic art that decorates them, and the ritual practices centered on them were not separate domains assigned to separate specialists. They were aspects of a single, integrated engagement with the world, all serving the same fundamental purpose of maintaining the relationship between the human community and the larger order of which it was part. The Druidic tradition that preserved and transmitted this integration in the Iron Age was not distorting an originally purely scientific tradition by adding religious content. It was maintaining the original integration that had characterized the megalithic tradition from its beginning. And this integration is precisely what made the tradition so resistant to Roman penetration. The Romans were expert at compartmentalizing knowledge. They separated law from religion, engineering from philosophy, military organization from cultural practice. They had specialists for each domain and administrative structures that kept the domains separate and manageable. The British tradition, in which the same body of knowledge encompassed astronomy, landscape reading, ritual practice, philosophical reasoning, legal memory, and historical tradition, and in which the specialists who held that body of knowledge were simultaneously astronomers, priests, judges, historians, and natural philosophers, was not organized in a way that the Roman administrative mind could easily understand or systematically undermine. To destroy it, you had to destroy the people who held it in their bodies. And that is what the Romans ultimately tried to do at Anglesey. They did not succeed completely. The evidence for the persistence of indigenous British cultural traditions through the Roman period and beyond is substantial. The survival of Celtic languages in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland through to the present day is the most obvious example. But there are others. The persistence of certain sacred sites as continuously venerated locations from prehistory through the Roman period and into the medieval period and beyond, such as holy wells, hilltops, and specific landscape features associated with supernatural beings, suggests a continuous tradition of place-based sacred practice that survived every political and demographic change on the island. The figures of the Irish and Welsh mythological traditions, preserved in manuscripts from the medieval period, contain narrative elements and cosmological concepts that specialists in comparative mythology have argued derive from a pre-Celtic stratum of belief reaching back to the Neolithic. The triple goddess, the sacred king, the cauldron of rebirth, the world tree, the sacred grove, and many other figures and concepts that appear in the earliest recorded layer of British and Irish mythology are not the innovations of the Iron Age Celts. They are inheritances from much older traditions, filtered through the Celtic cultural form, but originating in the deeper stratum of the Atlantic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age world. The chalk figure tradition of southern England is another persistence worth noting. Figures cut into the chalk downland of England, including the Uffington White Horse in Oxfordshire, the Cerner Bass Giant in Dorset, and the Long Man of Wilmington in East Sussex, have been associated with prehistoric origins since the earliest antiquarian investigations. The Uffington White Horse is the most certainly ancient, dated by optically stimulated luminescence to around 1000 BCE, placing it in the late Bronze Age. Its stylized, dynamic form, which bears a much closer relationship to the horse images on contemporary Bronze Age metalwork than to any realistic representation, is consistent with an origin in the Bronze Age artistic tradition and suggests that the chalk figure tradition, whatever its ultimate origins, was part of the same artistic world that produced the abstract animal imagery of British Bronze Age and Iron Age metalwork. The act of cutting and maintaining large figures in the chalk downland is an act of landscape inscription, of writing meaning onto the landscape in a form visible from a great distance that is entirely consistent with the monumental tradition of the megalithic civilization. You do not simply cut a hill figure and leave it. You have to maintain it, returning regularly to clear the vegetation and restore the white chalk surface. The maintenance of a chalk figure across generations requires organized communal effort and a continuous cultural tradition attributing significance to the figure sufficient to motivate that effort. The entire tradition of landscape inscription that defines British prehistoric culture, the long barrows, the Hillforts, the stone circles, the cursus monuments, the chalk figures, the river deposits of votive objects, the sacred sites at springs and caves and hilltops, is a single continuous tradition of treating the landscape as a communicative medium, of writing meaning into the physical world in ways that persist across time and can be read by communities separated from the original act of inscription by generations or centuries. This is not primitive behavior. This is a sophisticated cultural strategy for maintaining communal identity and collective memory across long time spans, using the landscape itself as the medium of transmission, precisely because landscape is more durable than any other medium available to a pre-literate society. The medieval period inherited this landscape and its embedded meanings, and the process by which those meanings were reinterpreted through a Christian framework is one of the most interesting chapters in the long history of Britain. The Christian missionaries who arrived in Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries CE found a landscape saturated with sacred significance. Every spring, every hill, every ancient monument, already embedded in a web of story and practice that gave it meaning. The Church's response was not to destroy this web, but to convert it, to rename the sacred places, to replace the old stories with new ones, to plant churches at the sites of pre-Christian sanctity, and dedicate them to saints whose feast days coincided with the old seasonal festivals. The result was not the erasure of the pre-Christian landscape, but its Christianization, its incorporation into a new framework of meaning that preserved many of the forms while changing the content. Many of the holy wells and sacred springs of Britain and Ireland that were major pilgrimage destinations in the medieval period are demonstrably ancient sacred sites, their sanctity predating the Christian period by thousands of years. The springs at Bath, the well at Holywell in Wales, the wells and springs of the Irish landscape, all carry histories of sacred use that stretch back before any documentary record. The medieval pilgrims who visited these places were participating in a tradition of place veneration that their remote ancestors had practiced in forms they would not have recognized, but at the same places, for the same fundamental reason, the sense that certain locations in the landscape are charged with a significance that exceeds the ordinary, that they are points of contact between the human world and some other order of reality, and that visiting them and performing the appropriate acts of acknowledgement constitutes an important human obligation. This is the tradition that the Romans encountered and could not erase. This is the tradition that survives in fragmentary form in the landscape of Britain today. And this is the tradition that we are, very slowly and very imperfectly, beginning to recognize for what it actually was. The expression of a civilization of extraordinary depth, sophistication, and continuity, one of the longest-lived and in some ways most remarkable civilizations that has ever existed on the surface of the earth. 5,000 years of continuous cultural tradition in a single landscape. 5,000 years of accumulated knowledge about the sky, the land, the seasons, the water, the rock, and the relationship between all of these and the communities of people who lived among them. 5,000 years of artistic expression, of monument building, of ritual practice, of oral transmission, of economic exchange, of political organization, and of intellectual development. This is what was in Britain before the Romans arrived. This is what the Romans encountered, and partially suppressed, and partially preserved, and partially reinterpreted, and ultimately could not entirely contain. And this is what the stones on the plains and the hills of Britain still embody, waiting for the people who walk past them to stop, look, and ask the question that changes everything. Who built this, and what did they know? The answer is longer, and richer, and more astonishing than any of us were taught in school, and the work of recovering it is not finished. Every year, the evidence accumulates. Every year, the picture becomes clearer, more detailed, more humanly recognizable. The people who built these monuments were not mysteries or miracles or the product of alien intervention or the legacy of some lost advanced civilization from outside. They were people. They were intelligent, organized, curious, creative, spiritually serious, intellectually ambitious people who lived on this island and paid attention to it for thousands of years, and built into its landscape a record of their attention that has outlasted every attempt to deny or diminish it. The stones stand, the earthworks endure, the alignments hold, and the civilization they represent, which terrified the Romans not because it was barbaric, but because it was ancient in a way that Rome could not match, and sophisticated in ways that Rome could not easily categorize, is still there, legible in the landscape, waiting to be read. There is a body of evidence that receives less attention than the monuments, but that is in many ways equally significant for understanding the civilization that produced them. The evidence of everyday life in prehistoric Britain, the settlements, the field systems, the agricultural practices, the domestic crafts, the patterns of trade and exchange at the local and regional level, reveals a world of organized, functioning communities with sophisticated strategies for managing their landscapes and their resources that bears no resemblance to the primitive subsistence world that the older narrative assumed. The field systems of prehistoric Britain are an extraordinary case in point. Across the upland areas of Britain, where subsequent agricultural activity has not ploughed them away, the outlines of Bronze Age and Neolithic field systems survive in the landscape, visible from the air or from hillsides, as patterns of low banks and ditches that mark the boundaries of ancient cultivation plots. The most extensive and best preserved of these systems are found on Dartmoor in Devon, where a landscape of reeves, low stone walls that once divided the moorland into organized territories, covers an area of over 100 square kilometers. The Dartmoor reeve system was laid out in a coherent and planned way, with long parallel boundaries running across the landscape for miles and shorter cross boundaries dividing the long strips into individual plots. This is not haphazard subsistence farming. This is organized land management on a territorial scale, implying the existence of authority capable of coordinating land division across a wide area and enforcing the resulting boundaries over generations. The reeve system on Dartmoor dates to the Bronze Age, around 1500 to 1200 BCE, and it represents the fossilized outline of a landscape that was systematically organized for agricultural and pastoral use across an entire region. The people who laid it out were not just farmers managing their individual plots. They were participants in a system of territorial organization that required coordination at a level above the individual household, above even the individual settlement, to a level that encompassed the management of a large portion of an entire upland region. This is governance. This is the exercise of organized authority over a landscape and its resources that implies the existence of political structures capable of enforcing collective decisions. The same story is told by the evidence of Bronze Age agricultural intensification more broadly across Britain. Palynological evidence. The study of ancient pollen preserved in peat bogs and lake sediments shows that the Bronze Age was a period of substantial forest clearance and agricultural expansion across Britain. Woodland was cleared for fields on a scale that significantly changed the British landscape over the course of the Bronze Age, increasing the proportion of open land available for cultivation and grazing. This clearance was not the random result of individual farmers cutting down the trees in front of their house. It was a coordinated, sustained effort to transform the landscape for agricultural purposes, with implications for soil management, water management, and the long-term fertility of the cleared land that required planning beyond the immediate needs of the current generation. The Bronze Age peoples of Britain were not just managing the landscape for immediate subsistence, they were managing it for the long term, building into it the infrastructure of a stable agricultural economy that their descendants would inherit and build upon. This is intergenerational planning. This is the kind of relationship with the landscape and with time that you only develop in a society that has been settled in a particular place for long enough to have strong incentives to invest in its long-term productivity. And it is exactly the kind of relationship we would expect to find in a civilization with roots going back thousands of years before the Bronze Age began, in communities that had been managing their relationships with specific landscapes since the Mesolithic. The water management evidence from prehistoric Britain is another largely unappreciated aspect of this story. The wetland areas of Britain, particularly the Somerset Levels, the East Anglian Fens, and the various river floodplains across the island, were not simply avoided by prehistoric communities as inhospitable terrain. They were actively managed for the resources they provided, including fish, wildfowl, reeds, and summer grazing on seasonally dry ground. The Sweet Track in Somerset, a raised wooden walkway built across the waterlogged surface of the Somerset Levels in around 3800 BCE, is one of the earliest examples of wooden engineering in Britain. It was built from a specific combination of timber species, with a base of poles driven into the waterlogged ground and a planked walkway laid on top, in a technique that required both carpentry skill and knowledge of the hydrological behavior of the wetland it crossed. It also required planning across a substantial physical distance, since the track runs for nearly 2 kilometers across the Somerset Levels, and coordinating the supply of timber, the labor of construction, and the logistics of working in a waterlogged environment across that distance implies organizational capacity of a kind that goes well beyond individual household subsistence. The Somerset Levels also produced, in the late Bronze Age, the artificial island settlement of Glastonbury Lake Village, a community of perhaps 150 people living on a platform of timber, brushwood, and clay built out over the shallow water of the former lake. The construction and maintenance of such a settlement in a wetland environment is a major engineering undertaking, requiring continuous attention to the stability and waterproofing of the platform, to the management of the water around and under it, and to the supply of building materials from the dry land surrounding the wetland. The Glastonbury Lake Village was occupied for several centuries, and the quantity of material culture recovered from it, including fine pottery, metalwork, glass beads, wooden objects of considerable craft, sophistication, evidence of weaving and other textile production, and the remains of a varied and nutritious diet, tells us that its inhabitants were not marginalized survivors on the edge of Bronze and Iron Age society. They were fully participants in the material culture of their time, trading with communities across the region, manufacturing objects of considerable quality, and maintaining a complex and organized community life in an environment that most people would consider hostile to settlement. The diversity of environments successfully settled and managed by prehistoric British communities reflects a depth of environmental knowledge and a flexibility of technological response that we should find genuinely impressive. From the chalk downlands of the south to the granite uplands of Dartmoor, from the wetlands of the Somerset Levels to the northern islands of Orkney and Shetland, prehistoric Britons developed specific and detailed strategies for managing the resources of each environment, passing those strategies down through generations and refining them in response to climatic and ecological change. The result was not a single uniform prehistoric British culture, but a mosaic of local and regional adaptations to specific environmental circumstances, connected by shared traditions of belief, practice, and exchange, but expressing those traditions in forms that reflected the particularities of each landscape. This environmental diversity and the cultural flexibility it produced is itself a marker of sophisticated civilization. Simpler societies, societies with more limited technological repertoires and less accumulated environmental knowledge, do not manage to successfully settle and maintain communities in environments as varied as those that prehistoric Britons inhabited. The ability to read a landscape, to understand its resources and its limits, to develop technologies appropriate to its specific conditions, and to organize communities capable of living sustainably within those conditions over many generations is not a simple achievement. It is the product of accumulated experience, transmitted through oral tradition, expressed in practice, and refined over time in dialogue with the environment itself. The people who built and maintained the diverse settlement systems of prehistoric Britain were the beneficiaries of thousands of years of accumulated environmental knowledge. They knew their island in a way that no subsequent population has known it, because no subsequent population has had the same depth of continuous presence in the same landscape, managing their relationship with it through the same traditions and practices across the same extraordinary span of time. The Romans, who arrived in Britain in the 1st century BCE, were entering a landscape that had been comprehensively known and carefully managed for millennia before they arrived. Their roads, their towns, and their agricultural practices were not the introduction of order and management to an unmanaged wilderness. They were a different system of order and management, superimposed on an existing one that was, in many respects, more finely calibrated to the specific conditions of the British landscape than anything the Romans brought with them. The long history of Britain before the Romans, before the Celts, before the Beaker migrants, before the Neolithic farmers, is not a story of progressive development from primitive to civilized. It is a story of continuous, sophisticated, intelligent human engagement with a specific place over an extraordinarily long time. The monuments that this engagement produced, the astronomical knowledge it preserved, the environmental understanding it accumulated, and the cultural forms it generated are the legacy of a civilization that was in every important sense mature, complex, and impressive when Rome was still a collection of villages on the banks of the Tiber. And they built it here, on this island, with their own hands, their own minds, and their own accumulated knowledge, without help from Egypt, without guidance from Atlantis, without the intervention of any force more mysterious than the extraordinary capacity of human beings, given enough time, enough stability, and enough collective will to understand their world and express that understanding in forms of lasting beauty and enduring power. That is the story of the civilization that terrified the Romans. That is the story of what was in Britain before the Romans came. And that is the story that the stones on the plain, the earthworks on the downs, the carved chambers in the hills, and the astronomical alignments on the moors are still telling to anyone who takes the time to listen. Every time a new excavation opens in Britain, every time a new LiDAR survey processes its data, every time a new set of ancient DNA results comes back from a laboratory, the picture of what was here before the Romans grows richer, more detailed, and more astonishing. We are not at the end of this story. We are barely past its beginning in terms of what the evidence has yet to yield. The sites that have been excavated represent a tiny fraction of the total, and the techniques available to archaeologists today were not available to the people who dug the sites of the previous century. Much of what was found in those earlier excavations was recorded in ways that cannot be fully recovered now, and much of the information available in the soil was damaged or destroyed by excavation methods that have since been superseded. The future of prehistoric British archaeology is in the sites that have not yet been touched, which still contain their full complement of evidence in undisturbed contexts, waiting for the questions we have not yet learned to ask. The sites that have been excavated with modern methods and modern questions are already producing results that would have seemed impossible to researchers of a generation ago. The revelation that Stonehenge's bluestones were probably moved not in a single dedicated operation, but in a process that began much earlier, with some of the stones first erected at a monument in Wales before being dismantled and transported to Wiltshire, adds a layer of complexity to the story that raises entirely new questions about the relationship between the different sacred landscapes of prehistoric Britain. The suggestion, still controversial, that the stones may have been associated with healing practices at their Welsh source site before their incorporation into Stonehenge, raises questions about whether Stonehenge was understood as a monument that drew in the sacred power of other places, concentrating it in a single central location that served the entire island. The discovery of the Stonehenge Hidden Landscape Project's results, showing that the Stonehenge world extended far beyond what was previously known, including massive pits aligned with the monument and features in the surrounding landscape that had been invisible until modern survey techniques revealed them, is still being processed and interpreted. The sheer scale of what is emerging suggests that our current understanding of Stonehenge, whatever its strengths, is still a vast simplification of the reality that the evidence will eventually reveal. And all of this evidence, all of this accumulating detail and complexity, points in the same direction, toward a civilization of genuine depth and genuine achievement, one that built things meant to last and that did last, one that accumulated knowledge across generations and preserved it through oral tradition and architectural expression, one that managed its landscape with intelligence and care across a timespan that makes every other aspect of British history look very short indeed. A civilization that the Romans could not entirely understand, could not entirely suppress, and could not entirely erase, because it was written in stone and in earth and in the memories of a landscape that was already ancient when Rome was young. That civilization is part of what Britain is. It is the deepest layer of the British story, the one that runs underneath every subsequent layer that conquest and migration and cultural change have deposited on top of it. It is not gone. It is dormant in the landscape, waiting to be read. And the reading of it, imperfect and incomplete as our current understanding is one of the most rewarding and most important intellectual projects of our time. The next time you see an image of Stonehenge, or drive past Avebury, or walk the chalk downs of southern England and notice the long, low mound of a Neolithic barrow on the horizon, remember what it represents. It represents 5,000 years of human intelligence applied to the problem of understanding a world that did not come with instructions. It represents generations of skywatchers tracking the long, slow dance of the sun and moon across the horizon and encoding their observations in stone alignments that still work. It represents communities of people who understood themselves as participants in a cosmic order and who expressed that understanding in the most permanent medium available to them. It represents a civilization that produced more questions than the Roman world could answer, and a body of knowledge deeper and older than anything the Romans brought with them when they crossed the Channel. And it represents the people who were here first, who knew this island better than anyone who came after, and who left their mark on it in ways that 5,000 years of weather and politics and conquest and progress have not been able to erase. They were here. They were extraordinary. And the stones they left us are still standing.